Welcome to Solo, the world's most dangerous dog podcast. Join Solo and his long-suffering family in various misadventures about the trouble the best dog in the world can cause.
Solo and the flu. Mum wasn't feeling well at all. In fact, she had taken to her bed for a couple of days, which meant tempers in Solo's household was starting to fray. Dad was attempting to cope, but as the family consisted of 2 young teens who seemed to be hungry all the time, and a dog that demanded to be walked every 5 minutes, he started to become quite frazzled. When Mum had first told Dad, "I have a splitting headache," she hadn't been too worried. His wife rarely became ill, and even if she did, she was usually right as rain within a day or so. So when she asked Dad to drive the kids to school, he didn't grumble, as he expected his wife to be quite her old self again by the time he came home. But when he got home that evening and found his wife was still in bed, he realized she had come down with the flu, which meant she could be out of action for quite some time. He found a handwritten note from his wife taped to the fridge. Despite her illness, the note was written in her usual neat handwriting and contained quite a few to-do items for him. The note was short and to the point, but the list was long. Please do the following. Empty the dishwasher. Do the laundry next to the washing machine. Feed the kids. Make sure they do their homework. The kids both have tests tomorrow. Test them. Make sure they're in bed at a reasonable hour. You'll need to take kids to school in morning and pick them up. P.S. Solo needs a walk. When he read the list, his heart sank. All this, he thought. The idea of a quiet night at home watching television had evaporated. He sat down at the kitchen table and sighed. As he did so, Solo, who had been in his usual spot nearby, came up and nudged Dad's hand, a ruse guaranteed to ensure a head rub or two. Dad looked down at Solo as he stroked his large, soft, white head. "This won't be too bad, will it, boy? We can certainly manage for a day or so. Right?" He sounded almost pleading as he said the word right. Unfortunately for Dad, the day or two he had in mind to fill in for Mum began to stretch into nearly a week. For the umpteenth time, Dad went into the bedroom hoping against hope that Mum was beginning to feel better, as he felt he couldn't take much more of dealing with the kids, their homework, and Solo. Although, the more he thought about it, Dad understood that Solo really was the easiest to take care of. He didn't need clothes to be washed. He certainly didn't have homework either. All he needed was to be allowed outside and to be taken for a good walk at least once a day. Dad was starting to wonder if he had this having a dog was a bad idea thing backwards. Perhaps they should have just kept the dog and skipped the kid part. Still, he thought, as he pushed open the bedroom door, it was too late to do anything about it now. His wife was barely visible underneath all the blankets and discarded paper hankies. He cleared his throat as he set down a bowl of hot soup on the bedside table. "Feeling any better, dear?" he inquired hopefully. His wife raised her head barely higher than the blankets and muttered, "You've got to be kidding." Dad sighed, left the soup where it was, and gently closed the door behind him. Golf this weekend, was most definitely not going to happen. He went downstairs. As it was Friday evening, the kids didn't have any homework. Instead, they were out and about with friends. Dad sighed again. Peace and quiet, he thought. For a few minutes, anyway. He had almost forgotten that the vicar had asked to come by for a few minutes. Dad had no doubt that it was to ask for a donation for something or other. Hadn't his family done enough already? After all, if it wasn't for Solo, the church would never have raised the money for all the repairs to prevent the entire church from collapsing. Sure, Solo had once tried to run the vicar over with the family car and caused him to crash his bike, but as far as Dad was aware, Solo hadn't done anything to the vicar for at least a few months. No, Dad had told his wife, as he sat on the side of her sick bed before heading off to work that morning. He's definitely going to ask for money for some good cause or other. He'll try to guilt me into it, you'll see. His wife pulled the pillow over her head and ignored her husband. So that evening, Dad sat down on the couch, put his feet on the coffee table, something the kids weren't allowed to do, and closed his eyes. Time for a short nap. There may be no golf tomorrow, but perhaps on Sunday, he thought. Dad, like Solo, was sometimes way too optimistic. He was just about to drift off to sleep, where he hoped to dream about winning the local golf club championship, something Solo had interfered with last time, when he felt a nudging at his elbow. Dad ignored it. He felt it again. Without opening an eye, he said, "Go away, Solo, I'm taking a nap." There was a short pause, then once more, the nudge. Dad opened half of one eye and looked at Solo. "Please, Solo, just 5 minutes, please. Then I promise I will take you for a good long walk, okay?" He closed the half-open eye. Solo looked at Dad, but didn't move. He was well aware that Mum was ill. It bothered Solo to no end when a member of his family was sick. He had wanted to help out around the house, but there wasn't much he could do, although he had been pretty sure he could help with anything, including the kids' homework. Earlier that week, when the kids were sitting at the kitchen table struggling with their math homework, Solo had sat on the long bench along one side of the table, head resting on the table, as his eyes darted back and forth between the kids and Dad. But no matter how much he tried, Solo simply couldn't understand what it was the kids were trying to do. It turned out Dad wasn't much help either. "What is it with this new math? It makes no sense," he said to the kids as he rubbed his hair into a frizz of frustration. Solo looked at Dad, then back again at the two kids, trying to make head or tails about what was going on. Not for the first time, Solo wondered why it was that humans spent so much time fretting over things that really made no sense, when all you needed was a nice place to take a nap, the chance for a good walk, and the opportunity to chase a squirrel every once in a while. But that was a few days ago. Today, Solo was trying to get Dad's attention. While he wouldn't mind a walk, he really didn't feel up to it. For the past few hours, he had been feeling decidedly stuffy. His nose and throat itched, and his eyes seemed much more watery than normal. Worse, some type of slimy goo seemed to be dripping from his nose. Boy, it was annoying. Solo had wiped off some of it on the carpet in the living room, leaving a pool of ooze in his wake. But it seemed every time he got rid of some of the gunk, more returned in just a few minutes, dripping down from his nose and onto Mum's lovely white carpet. he had felt the best thing to do was to take a nap. But noticing Dad was free from taking care of the kids for a few moments, Solo had decided that perhaps Dad could make the slimy green ooze disappear from his nose once and for all. This is the reason Solo was attempting to get Dad's attention, for help with this stuff coming out of his nose, not to ask for a walk. Solo tried to get Dad's attention one more time. He placed a paw on Dad's knee. Dad ignored it. Solo moved his paw slightly. Dad still ignored it. Solo decided to use his secret weapon, his "pay attention to me" bark. This bark was not an angry bark. It was not a deep bark. It was a high-pitched bark designed to get the attention of any nearby human. It was generally considered to be so annoying and loud that Solo's family were convinced that astronauts in space could hear it. Solo cleared his throat and prepared to bark. Pitching his head back so he was staring at the ceiling, Solo let off his secret weapon. Dad jerked in his chair, taken totally by surprise, his eyes now wide open. Solo smiled to himself. He now had Dad's attention. "Solo," said Dad, "I told you I would take you for a walk, but not until later." Dad was not in the mood to pay attention. What with his wife being sick, having to deal with the kids, and the vicar coming over later to ask for a donation for some good cause or other, Dad had had enough. "Okay, you," he said to Solo, "outside." He grabbed Solo's collar in order to steer him outside, then at least he would have some time to take his much-deserved nap. But Solo refused to move. He just sat back on his haunches and looked at Dad. "Solo," began Dad, but then he noticed the green slime coming out of Solo's nose. "Good heavens, Solo, are you sick?" He bent down to get a closer look. "Yuck, Solo, that's disgusting. Let's wipe that off." He went and grabbed an old towel to wipe Solo's nose. Immediately, more dripped out. "Wow," said Dad. "Are you ill?" He looked more closely at Solo, and for the first time noticed that Solo didn't seem his usual self. Normally, Dad would have found a way to get his wife to take Solo to the vet by pretending he had some urgent work item to handle immediately, but today was out of the question. Then, noticing for the first time green-colored patches on the normally pristine white carpet, and realizing he would be blamed by his wife for not even being able to take care of the dog for a few days, Dad decided to take Solo to the vet there and then, and who knew, maybe he'd be fortunate enough to miss the vicar when he called. Telling his wife he was running a few errands, Dad bundled Solo into the back of the SUV for the short drive to the local vet. Luckily, they weren't too busy and were able to see Solo immediately. The vet got down to Solo's level, taking his temperature and peering down his throat and in his ears, all the while talking to Solo and saying how handsome he was. Solo liked her immediately. After a couple of minutes, she looked up at Dad. "He has dog flu," she said. "What?" said Dad incredulously. "Dog flu? Is there such a thing? You know, my wife's had the flu for a couple of days now. Are you telling me she gave Solo the flu?" "Oh, no, not at all," replied the vet. "Dogs can get a form of flu, but it's unique to dogs. Officially, it's called canine influenza. It's just an unfortunate coincidence, that's all." Dad shook his head in disbelief. The vet continued, "And just like human flu, there isn't really much you can do about it. You just have to let it pass. Don't let him get cold, and make sure to give him plenty of water. Keep him comfortable, that type of thing." "Perfect. Just perfect," said Dad. "Don't worry yourself. Dad wasn't worried. He had long been convinced that Solo would outlive them all. "Solo's a young, strong dog. He'll be fine," the vet continued. "But as with humans, just keep an eye on him, and if his condition worsens or he develops a cough, let me know immediately." She gave Solo a small treat as a reward for his good behavior. Solo didn't feel like himself. He wasn't sure why, but he did know he couldn't wait to get home and lay on his bed in the kitchen, not so close to the wood-burning stove so as to get too hot, but not so far away as to get cold. He waited as Dad paid the bill, which was far more than he was expecting. As they left, Solo could hear Dad muttering under his breath how having Solo was more expensive than having children. Ignoring Dad's complaining, Solo jumped into the back of the SUV. Normally, he would look around at the humans, walking, running, riding bikes, forever fascinated by what it was they seemed to do all day. But today, Solo's heart just wasn't in it. In fact, the motion of the car was making him quite sick. He laid down, but his head was starting to spin, and before long, the undigested contents of his breakfast left his stomach and partially covered the rear area of the SUV. That was the sight that greeted Dad when they arrived home. As he opened up the rear hatch, and Solo rather sheepishly jumped out, the unmistakable waft of Solo's mushy breakfast hit his nose. "Oh, Solo, what have you done?" Dad quickly took Solo inside, leaving the rear of the SUV open so fresh air could help get rid of the stinky smell. Solo made his way to his favorite spot in the whole house, his bed under the large kitchen table. His stomach was still quite queasy. He had a headache, and it seemed a never-ending line of that disgusting green goo was continually dripping out of his nose. Solo quickly fell asleep and dreamed of chasing squirrels with his friend Sonny the poodle. In the dream, he and Sonny were about to roll around in a large, muddy puddle when he was awakened by a loud knocking at the door. Solo half opened a watery eye and pricked up one ear. As Dad answered the door, Solo immediately recognized the voice of his dear friend, the vicar. It must be said, the vicar didn't consider Solo a friend. He had far too many unfortunate experiences for that to happen. Over the past year or so, Solo had taken a shine to the vicar, which was unfortunate for the vicar, as when Solo tried to help, chaos and pandemonium would ensue. As the vicar walked in the front door and shook Dad's hand, he looked around nervously. He had thought long and hard about coming to Solo's house. It was bad enough being around Solo at the church or on the road or, well, anywhere really. But being in Solo's house was tempting fate, he thought. Still, he needed to speak to Dad, and as Dad was always busy, the vicar thought it best to try and catch him at home where he wouldn't be able to say he had an appointment or was about to play golf. Under normal circumstances, Solo would have leapt off his bed and enthusiastically greeted the vicar, perhaps even offering a paw for him to shake. But Solo wasn't feeling his usual chipper self. His head ached more, his itchy nose itched more, and to make matters worse, the oozing green goo dripping from his nose seemed to be oozing and dripping more, maybe even greener. To make matters far worse, some of the goo had now congregated in his throat, causing it to itch, making Solo cough and snort. So Solo stayed where he was, closed his half-opened eye, but still kept one ear open, just in case he picked up anything of extreme interest. Dad showed the vicar into the living room, as the vicar looked anxiously around him for signs of Solo. He sat down in the chair offered by Dad. "Where's Solo?" he asked. "Oh, he's taking a nap somewhere, I expect," replied Dad. The vicar let out an audible sigh of relief, which didn't go unnoticed by Dad. Raising one eyebrow slightly, Dad asked, "So what can I do for you, Vicar?" The vicar explained he was hoping to borrow Dad's beautiful motorcycle and sidecar. "Just for an afternoon, you understand," he said. "It's for a good cause, you know." The vicar was going to ask the nice young lady that Solo had helped introduce him to on a second date, and hoped it could be a romantically sunny ride through the countryside. Dad had to break the news to him that he'd had to sell it, owing to an unfortunate incident with Solo and the sidecar. Otherwise, of course, he would be more than willing to let someone else enjoy the machine. Solo, thought the vicar, just typical. At every turn I seem to run into that infernal dog. "Well, I'm sorry to have disturbed you then," said the vicar to Dad. "I'll just be going. Although—" He paused for a moment. As he was here, he might as well ask Dad for a small donation to the church's Continuous Restoration Fund. "Continuous Restoration Fund," said Dad. "I thought you raised a lot of money not long ago, with, I might add, the help of a certain member of this family." "Well, yes, of course. But there's always more work needed. It's an old church, you know," the vicar replied. He fixed Dad's eyes with his. The vicar had often found guilt was a powerful motivator to get his parishioners to part with money, which is why so many of them typically avoided him. Okay, I'll just get my checkbook." Dad had decided a small donation would have to do. "I can't give too much, you know. I'll be right back." He headed to the downstairs office. As he left, Solo decided that, despite how he felt, he really wanted to pay a visit to his old friend the vicar. Feeling slightly wobbly, he gingerly got up and padded into the living room. The vicar, who had been looking at a picture of the young lady he had hoped to impress with the motorcycle and sidecar on his phone, didn't even notice Solo was there until he was within a few feet of him. He looked at Solo, startled. "Oh, hello, Solo," he said nervously, as he attempted to stand up to get away from that dog. But Solo was now standing very close indeed, preventing the vicar from moving. Solo took advantage of the vicar's still sitting and put his paw on the vicar's knee, his usual trick. The vicar decided to play along. How much danger could he be in? He was, after all, in Solo's house. No cars or bikes here, no squirrels for that matter. Plus, Dad was only a few feet away. He shook Solo's outstretched paw. But just as he did so, Solo felt he could no longer keep in a giant sneeze that was determined to come out. Also, he felt a deep urge to cough caused by the irritating gunk in his throat. A deep down, throaty, oozy, greeny, slimy, disgusting, smelly cough. The vicar leaned in closer to rub Solo's head. Solo took a massively deep breath. As the vicar was closer now, he noticed for the first time Solo's runny eyes and the green ooze coming out of his nose. His eyes widened as Solo's big mouth opened fully to take in the massive amount of air needed to sneeze and cough at the same time. Sensing what was coming, the vicar attempted to stand up, but, as has been explained before, Solo is a big dog. With him standing so close to the vicar and his paw on the vicar's knee, the vicar couldn't get out of the way quickly enough. Solo, seeing the fear in the vicar's eyes, wondered what could possibly be wrong. As he sucked in the last vestiges of air until his lungs were full to bursting. Then there was a moment's silence. The vicar stared at Solo. Solo stared back. Nothing happened. The vicar relaxed a bit. Then whoosh! Solo managed to sneeze and cough simultaneously. All the green goo that had formed a blockage in his throat suddenly shot out in a giant slimy ball, which slowly seemed to spin in mid-air and hang there for a split second. It then landed neatly onto the vicar's face, where it spread and dripped like a slimy green puddle, covering his forehead down to his chin, some even landing on his nice white starched collar. This first barrage was followed by a second that flung a thinner version of the green ooze from Solo's nose, neatly adding another layer. Solo, his eyes wide open, looked on in amazement. So that was what had been inside him all this time. How disgusting, he thought. No wonder I didn't feel well. Having disposed of all the oily ooze inside of him, Solo was suddenly feeling more like his old self. He took his paw off the vicar's knee and stood back, wondering why it was that the vicar seemed to get himself into all sorts of trouble. The vicar looked down at his clothes, which had taken a direct hit from Solo's second barrage. As he did so, slime dripped off his nose and onto his nice, clean slacks. He stood up, trying to think of the best way to clear his face of the gunk, which was now, as it was out of Solo, starting to harden into a second skin. He needed a bathroom and a towel quickly. Dad walked in, looking down at the mediocre cheque he had just written, attempting to avoid the vicar's gaze, which he knew would reflect how cheap Dad had been. In looking down, Dad failed to notice the vicar's predicament. "It's not too much, I'm afraid. You caught me at a bad time. Otherwise—" His voice trailed off as he now looked at the vicar. Sometimes it takes Dad a few moments to understand what is going on, in particular when it comes to Solo, but not this time. He knew instantly. He looked down at Solo, who, now feeling so much better, was rolling on his back, attempting to encourage the vicar to give him a tummy rub. Dad didn't hesitate. "The bathroom is just down the hall." Then he tore up the cheque and threw it in a small bin by the door. "It just occurred to me, we do need to take care of the old church, shouldn't we? I'll go and write another cheque." A minute later, he went to the hallway bathroom where the vicar had wiped most of the oily, gunky, smelly ooze from his person and handed the vicar a much larger cheque. The vicar looked at the amount, his eyes opened wide in surprise and appreciation. Sometimes, he thought, miracles do happen.
Find this story and more in the Books of Solo's Adventures at Amazon.com and at solothedog.com, with illustrations by Stephanie Schultz, edited by Catherine Perkins, published by Heavy Media. Ask for Solo at your favorite bookstore.